This one's from Sarah Marchand. She says, I'd love to know how you organize projects and any features on Scrivener that are important to your workflow.
Okay, I don't use Scrivener. I use Microsoft Word. I have seen Scrivener. Seems like a great tool. I didn't train on it, and so I use the document map on Microsoft Word in order to construct an outline. My outline is formatted section for plot, section for character, section for setting. And under the character heading, when I start building an outline, I will start with each character's character arc in several paragraph form, and then bullet points of important things that need to happen in order for that character arc to work. Under setting, it will just be all the important setting elements explained, kind of as if I had to try to explain them to an editor, because sometimes my editors see these outlines, but that just helps me when I read back through. And then under plot is usually bullet points, where I've arranged all the bullet points from above into sequential interwoven, mixed with the kind of big plot beats. And then I just kind of start working through using that as an outline. I usually keep a separate document called my floating outline, which is like the minutia of the stuff to remind myself needs to go in the next chapter as I'm doing it. But otherwise, I'm looking at this big document, keeping the floating outline going, and then writing chapter by chapter, beginning to end. I go chapter 1 to chapter end. I know other writers jump around, but I don't.
Okay. Andy Pandy asks, I'd like to know if you've always planned for there to be an overarching Cosmere linking your works, and if you would do anything different in establishing that linked world if you had the chance to start again.
So the Cosmere came about partially on accident, intention, but accident. When I was a young kid reading books, one of the things I like to do is imagine that some of the characters were having adventures off screen. Just to, I was a budding writer. And so I'd be like, oh, these characters, this is their story. And then I started having those characters cross over between worlds. I would go from an Anne McCaffrey book to a David Eddings book. And I'd be like, in the back of my head, oh, this is this other character from Anne McCaffrey's world. And eventually that developed into this kind of fun game I was playing behind the scenes. When I started writing my own books, I inserted several of these characters as Easter eggs for myself, and actually had this sort of, these characters are moving between these different worlds I'm writing. When I finally sold, I sold my, when I had finished my 13th novel. By then I had constructed a lot of this, and I decided that I would make it a full-on feature, not just an Easter egg. And so when I wrote Mistborn, which was the first book I wrote knowing it would be published, I doubled down on this and really constructed this narrative from an Easter egg into something real. And so in my unpublished books during those early years, it was all Easter eggs and fun. But when I got published, I decided to make it a real thing, a selling point. Would I do anything different? I have read that book where the person is given a chance to change something from their past. It never goes well. If I were offered that opportunity, I'd say no, thank you. Whichever devil figure is trying to get me to take this. Everything's turned out great for me, so I wouldn't change a thing. But that's not what you're actually asking. What are you actually asking? I think that I would start earlier taking better notes of the things I tell to fans when they ask me questions, because sometimes I forget that. And then years later, I'm like, what did I say about this thing? What did I canonize? And then I have to like search through the fan wikis and things and see, and then I end up contradicting myself. I'm really good at keeping consistent on the things that I'm putting in books, but the things that fans ask me and I'm like, I hadn't thought of that. I think I would do this. Then later on, they come back and said, oh, you said you do this. And I'm like, that's actually a better idea than what I did. So, yeah.
Okay. Dinah Scott asks, if you, she says she knows that you don't recommend having a job as a computer programmer for aspiring writers. What advice do you have for the brain drain? I assume that this is for anybody who's overworking their poor head.
So my friends who have done this, I have never had to do this. So I would recommend finding authors who did have to do it and getting their advice rather than the guy, because I worked a menial job. Basically, it was a service industry job, but a menial service industry job until I sold and became a full-time writer. And so I never had to worry about brain drain. All the other work I was doing was stuff that did not take that much of my brain. I will say that friends that I've had who were in industries that did have this sort of issue where they get home at night and feel like they were exhausted and couldn't do the same type of work again, they all made their careers by getting up early and writing in the morning or by writing at lunch.
Yep, absolutely. So Amy Ziegler asks, when is Alcatraz 6 coming out? Seriously, one of my favorite series.
Well, thank you. Alcatraz 6 is done and is in the artist's hands, and she is doing art right now. Looks like next year is our publication date.
Okay. Monica Zwickstra has a couple of questions. First, how long were you writing before you found an agent and a publisher?
So I went about it in kind of an odd way. Early in my career, so I started my first book when I was like 15, 16, but that one doesn't count. I never finished that. So I don't count that in the numbers. The first real book I started, I was 19. And I finished it when I was 22. I heard early on that your first few books are generally terrible, which is not always true. There are lots of people who've written great first novels and they've been published. Name of the Wind was the first novel. But I took it as kind of permission to not have to be very good yet, and that I could write 5 books without being very good. So I wrote 5 books without really even trying to figure out how the industry worked. I went to local science fiction cons, heard a little bit of things about agents and stuff, but really didn't know the business at all. When I sat down and was very serious about it was with my 6th book, which was called Elantris, which is the one that eventually sold. I wrote Elantris, and then I was trying to figure out what to actually do. And then this guy came and started teaching a class at BYU who was an actual professional writer who I'd heard of before, which was like, I'd never had anything like that happen. I'm like, a real writer is teaching a class? And so I was taking grad student classes then, but I jumped back, and Dave's class was a 200 level class. I'm like, I'm getting into that. And I took Dave's class, and Dave talked about the business in ways I had never heard it talked about before. And so I eventually went and chatted with Dave in his office. It was really fun because I remember, I don't know if you remember this, Dave, but he's like, I never get to use an office. They gave me one. Let's see where it is. And we walked to the office, and it was like your first or second time being in your office. Dave said to me, well, here's where I said, I'm doing all the stuff you talk about in class already. I've written 6 novels. I'm on my 7th. And he's like, okay, you're on this different level. Here's what you're going to do. And back then, it's still viable, but it was even more important back then was the con circuit. Again, you can do it now, but it's not the only way now. Self-publishing has changed that a lot and whatnot. But back then it was go to the con. So he's like, Brandon, you're going to a World Fantasy Convention and to the Nebula Weekend this year. Find some money. And so I did. I flew to both of those conventions. And at the first one I went to, which was the Nebula Weekend, I met Joshua Bilmus, who eventually became my agent. And at the, not that year's, but the year after's World Fantasy Convention, I met Moshe Fader, who eventually became my my editor. So Dave's advice just kind of was right on target for that period in time. People were selling a lot through the conventions. I actually met Moshe, sent him a book, and he sat on it for 18 months. Moshe is famously slow. Tor is famously slow, and Moshe was the slowest at a slow publisher. And he eventually called wanting to buy it. I had sent stuff to Joshua, and he had rejected them all. But with really nice editorial letters that were really sharp. And so when I got the call from Moshe, I sold without an agent. I had been writing then, I started when I was 19, and this was 2003. So I was 28, so 9 years. I got the phone call from him. I immediately called Joshua and said, hey, a book I never showed you has an offer. Would you like to represent me? He said, well, I would love to read that book. And so he did and said, yes, I would love to represent you. And so in 2003, I landed editor first, then agent. This was about 7 years before the self-published revolution. So I went very much through the traditional route.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember that meeting. I think it really was the first time I'd been in that office. And
it felt like it. You're like, they gave me a key. I don't even know which one it is. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. And I remember that your first response was, I couldn't go to a convention because I have to work, and I was like, well, can somebody take over for the weekend?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, my brother can do that. Okay.
Yep.
Next
oh, you're
problem.
absolutely right. I've forgotten that, Dave. That was when my brother worked at the hotel. Yep.
And then you didn't have enough money, and I said, do you have a credit card? And we figured out how you would do it mathematically. So anyway, yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
I mean, the single most important thing in my life is probably that meeting I had with Dave in that room. So
yeah. So here's a really good question from Monica, I think. What is the writing technique that you struggle with the most and that you needed to get in order to reach the publishable stage? For example, was it learning deep POV or dialogue or character creation or something else? That was a major game changer to your writing in the early years.
This is an excellent question. For me, it was revision. I am a classic, I'm a classic, what we call outline writer, architect, as George Martin says. In that early in my career, I never wanted to perfect anything. I just always wanted to be moving on to the next project. Now, I know that there are some people, Dean Wesley Smith in particular, who don't believe in revision at all. I feel that I did not sell until I learned to take a good manuscript and make it great. And how to do that on my own without an editor or anything like that. I do rely on beta readers and writing groups. They are very useful to me. But I think one of the keys was also learning to use them as a test audience, not as an editorial team, if that makes sense. Being able to navigate how people respond to fiction and figuring out how to better target my narratives so that they match what people are interested in and excited by was really a vital part of me learning to get publishable. Early in my career, I talk about, I wrote 13 novels. I really had this sense of I'd finish one and be like, the next one will be better. And I put that one aside and wouldn't look at it again and then would try the next one. And for me, that process, I do think it's possible to over revise, particularly some writers who are what we call discovery writers, who they love revision and can submit the same chapter 15 times to a writing group. That's definitely a problem, but learning to do a solid 5 drafts for me was the big thing that got me from good to great.
Great. So this is from Mike Jack. He asks, how do you decide when to follow advice and when to try something your own way? What are the benefits and drawbacks to either at different times of your career?
Well, there's never anything wrong with trying out some advice. That's the thing. Early in your career in particular, trying new things is really handy. But even as an experienced and seasoned writer, saying, you know what, other people swear by this process. Why don't I just try it? Or, people keep saying this about my writing. What if I tried something different? Newer writers are really precious about every chapter. Experienced writers, in my opinion, often will write a chapter and be like, well, that one didn't work. I'll try it again tomorrow. And then they try it again and it works. Or they try something new with a different style, or like, I'm going to rebuild this, and they'll be like, nope, that didn't work. And they'll revert to a previous draft almost entirely. And so there's never a problem with trying things out. You will only grow if you try new things. It may not be something that is good for you, but it's worth trying. More difficult is learning to take people's advice, because in general, your average reader is good at noticing when something isn't working for them, but bad at fixing it, bad at knowing why. And so a lot of times, just getting a lot of beta reader feedback and learning how to sort through, oh, they're all having this problem, but what the problem actually is that I didn't set up this promise right. And that's a lot of them, is the promises and payoffs. You've set up the wrong promise, so they're expecting something you're not doing. The bulk of your writing is doing something they're not expecting. They're responding poorly to it. A newer writer often would say, oh, I need to give them what they want. And an experienced writer would say, no, the original story I'm trying to tell is the right one. The promise is off. If I make the promise better, then they will expect the things I'm actually doing and will be invested in them. But that takes a lot of practice and time, and it doesn't work for every writer. Some writers, that sort of feedback is poison for. And so it's learning your own process and learning how to take feedback in a way that is useful to you is just a big part of transforming from journeyman writer to pro.
Okay, and here's another question. How do you determine when a draft, project, or venture isn't going to work out, or is just not right, is just one that you don't want to do right now?
For me, I only abandon these things if I try several times to fix something and it doesn't work. And I don't have a fix in mind that will. I do this very rarely, and I strongly recommend that newer writers avoid this abandoning projects, because the consistently abandoning projects and starting something new is one of the big killers of early careers. But when I've done it, it's because my aggregate instinct tells me that even if I were to fix this book, it's not going to click with audiences yet, because I'm not ready to fix this book in the way it needs to be done. And the times I've done that, the few times I've done that, I've always been very glad that I did. But I've seen this sort of thing ruin a bunch of writers. And so I would try to avoid abandoning projects until you have a few novels under your belt. The only one I give you permission to abandon as a new author is that one that you've been working on in your head since you were a child, and that is now way bigger than you can possibly do justice to, and is like a millstone around your neck. And you'd be much better off doing something fresh and clean and new to improve your skills. You can abandon that one and do it once you get really famous and you know how to do it. But those other ones, something you pick up for NaNoWriMo, you're like, I'm just going to write this. Try not to abandon those. Try to see them all the way through, because nothing will teach you how to finish books more than finishing books. And you will consistently have problems with your middles and your endings if you give up every time a middle and ending is hard.
Good advice. Okay. How do you, excuse me, this one's, when did you feel like you really came into your own as an author?
I actually am lucky, because my career, where I didn't publish for those first 10 years, was really handy for me, because I feel like I came into my own with book 13 of unpublished novels, book 13 and book 14, which means that I hit the ground running when I published Mistborn, and then in particular, or Launchers, and then in particular Mistborn. People are like, wow, this doesn't feel like a second novel, because it was my 14th. And a lot of my friends in the industry, if you look at my my group of writers, which include Pat Rothfuss and include Scott, and just a lot of these people, there's a lot of authors in my particular group who did not have that early 10 years learning their own process before fame hit them. They had not figured out how to consistently be a novelist before they were required to do it for a job. And I feel like I had, and that was really fortunate for me. I really worry, I love the indie publishing revolution, what it has done for democratizing the publishing industry. I dislike some things about it, primarily that Amazon rules the roost and charges everyone enormous fees these days in order to market their books on Amazon. But One thing that I worry about with it is authors publishing really early. Like, I feel that if I had published those early books of mine, I would have been locked into that quality level, or I would not have understood how to be consistently high quality in my writing. And it was really good that I had 10 years to just practice.